Good evening. My name is Suhaili Bautista Carolina, and I'm the Director of Public Programs and Partnerships at the American LGBTQ Museum. And it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's program, Oregon's No on 9 campaign. 30 years ago, battle lines were drawn across Oregon through an unprecedented series of 35 anti-gay ballot measures. Our guest this evening will tell stories of leaders who mobilized to defeat hate and build a stronger statewide movement to defend the rights of all citizens. Today, when we experience a proliferation of anti-LGBTQ bills in state houses across the country, when we see educators threatened for teaching about Black, brown, and queer lives, when families are attacked for affirming their children's gender identities, we look back to these moments of intersectional strength for inspiration and encouragement. Now, I'd like to introduce our host for this evening's program, Holly Pruitt. During the No on 9 campaign, Holly was Executive Director of the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, one of the 4 community-based organizations supported through Western State Center as the Oregon Democracy Project. As an out lesbian activist involved from the first campaign against the Oregon Citizens Alliance in 1988, Holly served as primary organizer and then deputy manager of the campaign to defeat 1994's Measure 13, which led to the formation of Basic Rights Oregon. Without further ado, I now turn it over to Holly. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the program.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much to the museum for hosting this program, and thank you to all of us for joining us. I'm here today with some longtime movement friends, and we, the panel, are only a few of the more than 50 folks from No on 9 Days whose insights and stories are featured in noon9remembered.org. And I wish we could see the faces of everybody who's signed on here. It's like a virtual reunion. So many of us, I think, gave so much at that time, and it's amazing to be together in this webinar remembering. I really wish we had time to hear from everyone, but we do encourage you to use the Q&A function if you have anything that you want to add to the conversation, and we'll try to speak out all of those contributions before we end. I want to introduce our panelists now. So Thalia, Cecil, and Scott, if you could please all come on camera so that you can wave. I'll go in alphabetical order here. So Cecil Prescott is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ and a brother in the Order of Corpus Christi. And he was part of a number of grassroots community responses to Measure 9, including People of Faith Against Bigotry and Love Makes a Family and African Americans Voting No on 9. Hi, Cecil. I'm hoping we will be joined by Eric Ward, who is Executive Vice President of Race Forward and Senior Advisor to Western State Center. And Eric was co-curator with me of noon9remembered.org. And during No on 9, he was an organizer for Communities Against Hate with the Community Alliance of Lane County in Eugene. Scott is currently director of the 22nd Century Initiative. He served on the staff of the No on 9 campaign and then was organizer with the National LGBTQ Task Force's Fight the Right project. Hi, Scott. And Thalia Zapatos, consultant with Freedom to Marry Global, was No on 9's deputy campaign manager and later director of organizing and training at the task force, and then with Freedom to Marry. So we will hear from each of them after I provide a bit of an overview about No on 9 Remembered. So we'll start to take a look at some slides as I talk through this. No on 9 Remembered is a narrative history project hosted by Western State Center. For over 35 years now, Western State Center has supported inclusive democratic movements from its base in the Pacific Northwest and Mountain States, from organizing against the Christian right in the 90s to the Trump years when Eric Ward returned to Oregon to lead Western State Center, knowing that anti-democracy formations like the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, and other MAGA forces were testing strategies and building movement here in this region in a way that would affect the nation as a whole, just as we'd seen in the 90s. As you heard in the introduction, I was with one of the groups at Western State Center, helped to mobilize the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. Scott and Cecil were both part of another, the Coalition for Human Dignity. We've got one of the old time posters from CHD here. They were an opposition research shop that played a key role in countering the racist neo-Nazi skinhead movement that forms a backdrop to this story. So what was Measure 9? It was a constitutional amendment mandating discrimination against lesbians and gays that was placed on the ballot in Oregon through a signature gathering effort led by a Christian right organization called the Oregon Citizens Alliance, OCA for short, headed by two fellows named Lon Mabon and Scott Lively. Measure 9 was one of 35 statewide and local anti-gay ballot measures that Oregon voters fought over in the 26 years from 1978 to 2004. It was the most nationally prominent of those, known to history now as one of the most comprehensive and harshest anti-gay measures put to voters. After nearly 2 years of courageous mobilization by thousands of Oregonians from literally all walks of life, voters rejected Measure 9. Now, Eric and I wrestled with how we could possibly tell the story of a collective effort that employed every possible tactic and changed the lives of so many of us and contributed so much to so many movements going forward. And so we decided to tell 30 stories, 3 a month over 2022, to commemorate the 30 years since the campaign. And we embedded those stories in a larger timeline and in the context of other communities' liberation struggles. We started the timeline in 1970 when the work to end criminalization and legalize discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity became visible as a movement in Oregon. And we end the timeline 45 years later when Oregon was named the second most LGBTQ friendly state in the nation, although we know from today's backlash that no rights are permanently secure. It was important to us to acknowledge that the Oregon LGBTQ plus community story is part of a national LGBT rights movement that intersects with all of the great 19th and 20th century civil rights movements. Queer people were and are a part of the racial justice civil rights movements, the labor, immigrant rights, disability rights, and feminist movements, and other social justice struggles, both as members of those communities and as allies. So for that reason, we included a larger timeline of civil rights abuses and victories in Oregon, reaching back to 1788. We also brought that same larger context of intersecting movements to our resources section, which has links to archival material specific to No on 9 and films and articles covering the campaign, including Arlene Stein's book, The Stranger Next Door, which has just been recently updated for our current times, and the chapter on Oregon in Suzanne Farr's essential book, Transformation. We thank the Gay and Lesbian History Archives of the Pacific Northwest and the Oregon Historical Society for their essential work, helping to preserve queer community history. But we led our resources section with a sampling of contemporary historical memory projects focused on the liberation struggles of other communities, along with, you can see on the lower right is an image to the deeper dive on the Eugene lesbian community, as showcased through the wonderful Outliers and Outlaws project at the University of Oregon. And I really encourage you to check out all of these on our resources page. So before we go into the stories that reflect some of the lessons of ballot measure 9, I was hoping that Eric could speak about why it's important for us to remember. And some of his statements on this topic really formed essentially the mission statement of no19remember.org. Eric says, we have to become a movement that understands the long arc of history. Learning from earlier struggles teaches us discipline and helps prevent the sin of despair. And as we rolled out, excuse me, the stories through the course of 2022, Eric reflected at different times on different aspects of his involvement. He said at one point that for him, it was about being part of a statewide mobilization. He said his role wasn't very significant. He said, I was just one of many, but the impact remains to this day. I saw firsthand how campaigns can help to develop leaders and build a movement. I learned how to speak in public, in part through speaking out against Measure 9. It was the first time since I'd moved to this nearly all-white state and town, Eric said, that I felt like I was part of a large community. And it was the most diverse community I could be a part of in Oregon. The interplay of all these organizations and efforts created cross-community solidarity and provided folks a broader understanding of the authoritarian attacks on civil rights and democracy. So, Eric, I'm seeing you pop onto the screen right now. Welcome. And all right, on camera, on mic. I don't know if you heard Eric. I wasn't sure if you're going to be able to log on, and so I just shared some of what your voice had been during the course of No on 9 Remembered. But would you like at this point, I don't know if you want a little time to get settled, but to say anything more about why you launched this project, why you feel like this is an important time to remember this particular era?
I will very briefly. It's wonderful to see everyone. Thank you for your patience. It is apparently snowing in Portland, Oregon, and we're feeling it on my block here in Portland. It's wonderful to be with you all. Western State Center, under the leadership of Holly Pruitt, decided to embark on an educational campaign. And it was to revisit the lessons from the campaign opposing Measure 9, which I know you're running people through right now, Holly. For me and for Western State Center, there were really two critical pieces that we felt needed to be raised. So one is that on the cultural level, it was important to take a look at a moment where there was an actual moment of a popular front in Oregon, that there was this historical moment where people crossed lines of race, religion, gender, right, class, ethnicity, sexual orientation, in order to defend rights at a broad level. The other piece that I think was super important about this moment and this popular front was the vertical nature of it, right? That it both included a robust grassroots mobilization and, right, in larger civil society, within business, within government, within faith, right, that civil society as institutions also responded in this moment. It was one of those rare moments in a popular front, right, where you saw government officials standing arm in arm with grassroots activists who didn't agree on everything, but agreed in the idea of really kind of exploring the importance of holding rights. What was important also, Holly, right, I said two things. And the second piece was this, as we'll get into it a little bit more, right? What was significant also about this moment was the LGBTQ movement, right, was the leadership of this popular front. This is often lost in the conversation around No on 9. It is primarily seen as a struggle, right, on behalf of the LGBTQ community, right, or in allyship with the LGBTQ community. But the truth is that LGBTQIA leadership led the resistance, led this popular front. And as I talked about in the project, I said the LGBTQ community took the horror of the Oregon Citizens Alliance and gave something back to Oregon, something that was beautiful and powerful. It was a moment in time where I would have done anything for that popular front. People would call me, as I wrote, a homophobic slur, right, for years after my participation, right, in rural areas where I traveled to speak, often accusing me of running the secret homosexual agenda, right? I considered it to be a point of pride. Western State Center wanted to look at this moment of historical memory to draw lessons, to recognize the leadership that came before us, and to inspire us for what comes next. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Eric, for underscoring those points and also for your support of my work as senior fellow with Western State Center to revisit this time. So before I hand it over to Scott, I just want to underscore what we were all dealing with here in terms of what Measure 9 actually was. This is the actual language that appeared on the ballot. Voters had to say yes or no. Shall the Constitution be amended to require that governments discourage homosexuality and other listed behaviors and not facilitate or recognize them? The OCA called this the No Special Rights Initiative. And this was the final version, linking homosexuality as an abnormal behavior to pedophilia, but earlier versions also included reference to bestiality and necrophilia, sex with animals and corpses. Now, as in our present moment, anytime that bigoted and scapegoating rhetoric and the effort to deny the legal rights of a group of humans becomes popularized, it's always accompanied by violence. Measure 9 brought a dramatic uptick in hate crimes, including desecration of houses of worship, like the Metropolitan Community Church, this Catholic church, St. Matthew's, spray painted with swastikas and exhortations to kill gays, Latinos, Catholics, and Jews, and the firebombing that killed Hattie Mae Cohen, a disabled Black lesbian, and her roommate, Brian Mock, a disabled white gay man. So this is what we were dealing with. And because of our sense of the larger agenda that was at play, we situated the entire project in 1988 in what we called Act 1, the earlier hate murder of Mulugeta Sarah, an Ethiopian immigrant who was beaten to death on the streets of Southeast Portland by racist skinheads. So with this background of everything that we were immersed in, as Eric has brought us back to, let's go to Scott. And Scott, what can you share with us about what you think is relevant about what this measure was really about and the impact that that kind of atmosphere of violence had?
Well, thank you. Let's see. Well, I think that one thing that is important for us to keep in mind is that this ballot measure was part of a broader strategy on the part of the evangelical right wing in the US to make the case that there was a minority takeover taking place, that mainstream majority Americans should be very concerned about, that language special rights spoke specifically to that. It made it incredibly important for us to be able to defeat this measure at the ballot box, in spite of the fact that I think we went into it understanding it was unconstitutional. We needed to show the public that a majority of people, mobilized through the broadest coalition possible, would reject this kind of bigotry. And we needed to do that by appealing to the self-interests of that broad coalition. It wasn't simply about, will you protect gay people, but it was, will you protect these democratic principles? Will you protect the Oregon Constitution from being degraded in this way that might allow bigotry more broadly, right? And I think that for that, it was very important. It was a really early kind of test of something that I think is really important to us now as we face this white nationalist uprising in the United States. We need to be able to build the broadest coalitions possible. We need those coalitions to encompass a supermajority of people's interests. And we need to be able to cobble it together by appealing to specific interests across a broad spectrum. So while it's a racist movement and a sexist movement and an anti-Semitic movement, we also need to speak to how ordinary people who don't fit in those identity categories will be impacted if authoritarians can take power at the state or federal level. And so those lessons, I think, are important ones for us to pull from this. And I hope that the panelists will draw upon those threads.
Thank you, Scott, for laying that out. Very dense and all so critically important. So before Cecil and Thalia share their thoughts. I want to give you a brief look at some of the many communities that mobilized against Measure 9 by kind of running through some of the slides here. The 1990 census, just before this campaign, counted more than 90% of Oregonians as white, just under 4% Hispanic or Latino, 2.4% Asian, 1.6% Black, and 1.4% Native American. Now, since then, Oregon's population has grown by 1.5 million, but remains 84% white, 44th among states for our percentage of African Americans. This tells us something about why Oregon is such a testing ground. With this, it took incredible courage for queer folks of color to come out in their communities at that time and to be visible to the larger state. Kathleen Sadat, who had served as the state affirmative action director, asked her closest allies in the Black community if they would have her back when she came out on the cover of the leading gay paper. That formed the beginning of African Americans voting no on 9, which worked on many fronts, including with Black clergy, canvassing barbershops, and bringing national civil rights leaders to town like Jesse Jackson. When the Farm Workers Union, PECUN, was asked to host a group doing a long distance walk opposing Measure 9, they asked, well, where has the lesbian and gay community been for farm workers? Those hard and honest conversations began an alliance that continues today and serves as a national model. Asian Americans opposing 9 was the first openly queer pan-Asian effort of its kind in Oregon. One of its key organizers, Lynn Nakamoto, became the first Asian American and first woman of color and second lesbian on Oregon's Supreme Court. Building from the battered women's shelters and rape hotlines in each of our 36 largely rural counties, created an analysis and an infrastructure for rural activism that's still going strong through the Rural Organizing Project, which yesterday filed the first sanctuary lawsuit against its now headquarters city. So Marcy Westerling lives on. Portland Police Chief Tom Potter and his out daughter Katie, an officer on the force, made national headlines with their role fighting Measure 9 and challenging entrenched police culture. And in one marker of how much has changed, even as homophobic and transphobic attacks are back on the rise, back then, every mainstream Republican in the state came out against Measure 9. The campaign mobilized countless straight allies, created a huge boom in PFLAG membership, and made it a mainstream expectation that Oregon businesses would take a stance against discrimination. Now, this was before the internet was commonly available. Newspaper endorsements really matter. Every major newspaper came out against Measure 9, including an unprecedented 12-part editorial series and front page message from the Republican Roman Catholic publisher of the state's major daily. Just Out played a central role in rumor control and publicizing the dozens of sometimes competing ways to get involved. They and mainstream journalists around the state were targeted by threats and vandalism just for covering the campaign. The campaign reflected not only the incredible courage in this time of heightened violence of everyone involved, but also tremendous creativity. Among the innovations were Bigot Busters, which did street-level education where petition signatures were being collected, education in the faith community, which at the time had barely recognized its queer clergy or congregation members, groundbreaking organizing in organized labor, and an incredible array of educational outreach from videos to speakers bureaus and beyond. Artists and culture makers from big acts like Nirvana to community choirs brought the No on 9 message to new audiences and kept our spirits up and helped to showcase the hypocrisy of the Christian right, like this satirical piece by the No Special Righteousness Committee. Now, some of these tactics were totally original and others built off examples and honored other movements like the Walk for Love and Justice, which fostered visibility and conversation in small towns as they walked 150 miles from Eugene, where Urvashi Bad, then director of the National Task Force, led the kickoff rally to join the Gay Pride March in Portland 2 weeks later. Now, all of these efforts took place alongside what was sometimes called the mainstream campaign or the official campaign, which was a Herculean effort that raised money for public opinion research and advertising buys, while fielding media interest from literally around the world and being terrorized by multiple break-ins and threats. They systematically engage thousands of volunteers in voter identification, persuasion, and get out the vote. These proven electoral campaign activities that are aimed to conventionally just get 50% plus one of the vote on election day, but were done in this case whenever possible with an eye to longer term movement building, thanks to the creativity and insistence of some of the campaign staffers and leaders like Scott and Thalia, Kathleen Sadat, and Suzanne Farr. Thalia worked inside the campaign organization and Cecil at the grassroots level out in the community. And so I want to turn first to Cecil and then to Thalia to share your observations about this array of communities and the efforts that they brought to this.
Thank you for organizing and for your work. I also want to thank all those who are gathered here. As others have noted, the No on 9 campaign was a movement that brought together people from all walks of life in all parts of this state, and was an ability to transform our society. We heard about the mention of the murder of Mulugeta Sarah, who was an Ethiopian student. He was murdered on the streets of Southeast Portland. At that time, I was a pastor of a small church here in Portland, and his murder, to quote Immanuel Kant, actually stunned me from my dogmatic slumber. Of course, I was aware of social issues and certainly grew up in a family where struggling for social justice was in our DNA. But the murder of that young man moved me in such a way that I needed to move out of my place of comfort and needed to expand. So what happened was a realization on my part of the need to connect with other people in different areas of the city and of the state, which enabled us to work together. By the time Measure 9 became a possibility and indeed a reality, I and many people were involved in many different groups. A lot of grassroots organizing took place, and people who did not know one another began to gather and find ways in which they could organize, and ways in which they could actually transform our society. An amazing thing about the No on 9 campaign was the creation of intersectionality in terms of, we heard some earlier, of people from different walks of life, from different interests, working together to find ways in which they could challenge this awful ballot measure. I was involved in a number of groups. I just want to highlight two in terms of what they did. As noted earlier, no major Christian group at that time welcomed openly queer members or queer clergy, except for the voices of Quakers, Unitarians, and the United Church of Christ. No major religious Christian denomination welcomed or ordained clergy who were LGBTQIA. And so the movement to push against this so-called ballot initiative by this faith group meant that queer members of churches had to stand up and say that they were working for something that transformed our society. People of Faith Against Bigotry was a grassroots effort of people who were Christians and Muslim and Jewish to speak, and we spoke in our different environments, in our different congregation, organizing one another. While the major denominations were able to speak out against this measure, it was important for people to work on a grassroots level to convince their neighbors, their people who sat next to them in a pew, that they were involved in something that was fundamentally against what they really believed in. For me, I also worked with an organization called Love Makes a Family, which was a lesbian-headed organization begun by Bonnie Tinker, may she rest in peace, who was at that time doing something that was a bit strange. They were advocating for queer headed families to have the right to raise their children, and also the unheard desire, effort to have queer marriage, same-gender marriages, which seems like, oh, that's ancient history. But at that time, 30 years ago, it was a debate within the queer community whether or not one should advocate for marriage, because marriage was so, well, we all know it's patriarchal in the history about that. So why do you want something that is so offensive and so dangerous? But the movement of Love Makes a Family was actually a movement of people saying that we need our voices heard and our families recognized. So that was a movement of families, of queer parents and children working to have their voices heard. And so people of Faith Against Bigotry, working within the religious circles, and Love Makes a Family, working in many circles throughout the state, saw that people were able to gather and to organize in their communities and begin to transform our society. I'll conclude by saying that that time was a very scary moment in our history, but as others have shared, it was also a time of empowerment where people discovered that they had voice, that they were able to make change, and that they were able to transform their society, our society, so that we could create a state where all people, all families felt safe and affirmed. It's something that began many, many years ago and continues today and will continue into the future. But what I learned from that was the importance and value of working together, of trying to find common interests, of working across our differences and finding ways in which we could affirm the dignity of all people in our society. Thank you.
Can I say an amen? Thank you, Cecil. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Cecil. You know, I came into the campaign because Scot Nakagawa asked me to come in for an hour or two and volunteer a little bit of help. I was a campaign professional, and that hour or two not only led to my working full-time on the campaign, but actually changed the course of my life in terms of my life's work ever since then. And so that's a testament to grassroots organizing and asking everyone to help. So, you know, I had come in as a straight ally with a sensibility around campaigning and experience in which, you know, typical electoral campaigns are run with a goal of centralized control and centralized messaging. And the fewest people should be making decisions that run the entire campaign. And as things would move forward with this incredible popular front and the amazing leaders involved, we together as a group developed this consensus around trying to run a movement campaign. And what would a movement campaign look like? But a campaign that really thrived by letting go of some of that central control, by investing in movement leadership and in partners. And I learned incredible lessons that I carry to this day and teach to other people about how partnerships with leaders from African Americans voting no on 9 and Asian Pacific Islanders voting no on 9 and the Piñeros and Campesinos Unidos in Latino communities could shape the messaging better than the central campaign could, and could also come up with much more effective outreach strategies. I think Holly mentioned, discussions in barbershops and hair salons in the Black community. Pecun had their own radio programming in Spanish language and talked a lot about ballot measure 9 on their radio program. So partnering with and taking leadership from this broad array of organizations and networks meant that the campaign benefited, and hopefully the movement also grew at that time. And I think we've seen in Oregon since Measure 9 a kind of broad recognition of leadership and a willingness to decentralize in some ways that are still maybe not so easy to do in some other places. Thank you.
Thank you, Thalia. We want to encourage you to start to use the Q&A box to share anything that you'd like our panelists to respond to, or we have such a wealth of knowledge, I know, among everyone who's joined as participants, if you'd like to offer any comments as well. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to think about any additional remarks they want to make about the legacy and the lessons of Measure 9. But before I do, we have a few more slides that are essentially about what happened next. That effort that Thalia began to talk about, how to build and sustain movements for justice in the midst of defensive electoral campaigns, to formalize those principles of movement building campaigns, was put to the test over the next 2 years and beyond, when the OCA came back with a sanitized version of Measure 9 and ran similar measures at the local level. Those campaigns resulted in the formation of Basic Rights Oregon, a statewide campaign-ready LGBTQ advocacy group that continues to be among the strongest in the country. A courageous and very persistent 22-year-old radical activist named Catherine Stoffer took it upon herself to go the litigation route while all the rest of this campaign work was happening. Her lawsuit sent Lon Mabon to jail for 42 days and eventually shut down the OCA. Thank you so much, Catherine. And of course, the fight against the OCA in Oregon created some of the infrastructure, some of the insights, and the fire in the belly that led to the nationwide victory for the freedom to marry. Thalia, as the message guru of those marriage campaigns, used research and partnerships in Oregon to unlock the winning message on marriage that allowed us to tell our stories of love and commitment that Bonnie Tinker had been so prescient to know were so important 30 years ago. So let's go back to our panelists, and I'd like to hear what each of you would like to say on further lessons and legacy. And Thalia, why don't we start with you, and then go to Scott and Cecil and Eric, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Thalia?
So I'll just tie into what you were just saying, Holly, by sharing that, over the years, Oregon, I think, and Basic Rights Oregon developed a reputation as an organization that could defeat anti-LGBTQ ballot measures, and helped to share lessons and ideas and strategies with so many other states and eventually at the national level. And as you mentioned, there's kind of a little known story that as the marriage movement tried to start to gain hold in the United States, it lost many, many times at the ballot, including in Oregon, with those one man, one woman referenda. And it was actually a partnership with Basic Rights Oregon that turned and let go of that kind of rights and benefits messaging around marriage. And it was actually someone in a focus group in Oregon who said love is love in describing a same-sex couple and their relationship, which became a huge national slogan, which is very prominent, in fact, all over the world now. So Oregon has played really a leading role at the national level and continues to do cutting edge work, I think, in terms of transgender issues and getting more state level support and recognition for LGBTQ people. And I'll just say, in terms of myself, that I've carried the lessons from that campaign and teach many, many people, and now work in over 20 countries on campaigns to fight non-discrimination, as well as legalize same-sex marriage in many different regions of the world. So it's been a very, very transformative experience for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Thalia, for your so many years of work and for everything you brought to this conversation. And thank you, Scott, for making that call to Thalia back then. I want to invite Scott, you and each panelist who speaks to, if there are any current day opportunities and activities that you want to point to that you think are important ways to continue this work, please do mention those. But Scott, what are your thoughts about this question of the legacy and the lessons?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to mention that I met Thalia because I was her house painter. That was the first way we came in touch with each other. But when she came onto the campaign, it was just an incredible learning experience for me. It became a school to many of us to work with her. And so I just wanted to say thank you to her for that contribution. I feel like what might be helpful here in part is to talk a little bit about the context of the time that we were working in, right? Back then, and I sometimes lose track of time, you get to a certain age and it seems like it was just yesterday when it was 30 years ago. But the LGBTQ community in Oregon, there was very little political infrastructure, right? The kind of political campaign experience that leaders had might be very strong across individuals, but the community didn't have much capacity for that kind of thing and not much infrastructure in place. The main LGBTQ organization or main gay organization, I should say, in Oregon was a group that bundled donations to friendly candidates. And as critical as that work was, what it meant was that a lot of the politics of the time was steered by donors. And so at the popular level, though, the rest of us were not necessarily hitting the doorsteps because this was a very unfriendly time for LGBTQ people. And so there was a lot of fear about what would happen if we, mounted canvassing operations and actually tried to meet the public at their doorsteps. And so this was for us kind of a first time for a lot of different things. And so I guess we could thank the OCA for actually having opened a door to this, right? Because we had to build so much infrastructure so quickly in that couple-year period of time that then became a foundation for many things that happened afterwards. I also have to say that while I would love to be able to say we had all intention around everything good that followed, it's not always the case, right? I mean, this was not just a case of a simple political campaign. It was a political campaign that occurred at the intersection of a social movement rising. And social movements are really messy. They can be places of argument and contestation, and they are oftentimes dangerous. And so the campaign had to negotiate all of those kinds of relationships in order to try to figure out how to eventually get to its goal. And every single piece contributed, but it was always clear to us that that was what was happening, you know. So there are lessons to learn after the fact about not being maybe so controlling as Thalia indicated, and, you know, recognizing that each moment holds many possibilities and that lots of things can accrue to a victory of this sort, and also the long-term legacy that has resulted. And so I would, you know, encourage people in these situations to not obey in advance, you know, let your freak flag fly, make the contribution you can. Don't worry about whether or not, you know, you think that the public will find you acceptable. The public will find you acceptable at the point at which they meet you and recognize you as a human being. And these are opportunities for us to do that at massive scale. Political campaign offers those kinds of opportunities, in the ongoing work of groups like Basic Rights Oregon provides us with that opportunity. So, you know, don't be afraid to get involved. And then the last thing I'll say that, you know, is since that time, a lot has changed. At present, a supermajority of the world's people live under authoritarian autocratic governments. That wasn't true at the time. That changes much of what we can accomplish in the United States in the advance of civil and human rights. It means that we don't have the same kind of international leverage. And of course, here domestically, an authoritarian movement or movements are rising that are, you know, asserting themselves all across the country. There are now, you know, basically 22 state authoritarian trifectas in the United States. So in this context, you know, we also see the return of, you know, these attacks on LGBTQ communities. For some, the attacks never stopped, but for others, it felt like we had a reprieve, and now we were returning to a point in which we need to fight for everything. We should keep in mind that many, many groups are under attack, that this is an assault on democracy, the idea of it, and the reality of it, and on our democratic freedoms, including the freedom to protest, the freedom to organize, to make our grievances known, you know, all of the vital pieces of democracy. And so to our friends in the LGBTQ community, I just want to say, you're not alone. You know, this is a time of opportunity. In spite of the fact that, yes, it's scary, this is also a time of opportunity. I think we can try to take these lessons from the past and figure out how we move in this moment in order to be able to, you know, gain the kind of traction and achievements that eventually the broad base beyond the campaign No on 9 coalition was able to achieve in Oregon.
Thank you, Scott, so much. Cecil, some thoughts from you about where we find ourselves today and the through lines then from No on 9 till now?
I always appreciate sitting and listening and hearing people, and I so appreciate the opportunity to hear the wisdom of the people around this table. I think among the things that I've learned from that time is the recognition that people have the power to make change in their own lives. They may not recognize the power. And that one thing that we discovered in that campaign, and I imagine it happens all the time, was that you know, there was the official campaign, and they did their job very well. And a point was to get 50% plus one. Our movement is more than that. It transformed the society. And while the individual campaigns are important, we must continue the work of movement building. There's coalition working, reaching out to those who are different, learning to understand what it means to work with or to move with people, and to listen and to learn. Among those things that I learned from that time was it was very important to allow people the space to be and the space to speak. They are the sole authority of what is right. And so for those of us who think we know all the answers, I think it's important for us to hear what other people have to say from their own experience. And so among the lessons I continue to take from that time is that we need to learn to honor and to respect different voices, and to be able to listen, and to be able to be willing to go beyond our comfort circle to reach out. That's what it took for this campaign to be victorious, to go and to speaking with your neighbors, and to be willing to risk to speak and to interact with those who are different. It's scary. There are no guarantees, but ultimately, I think it will be able to transform our societies.
Beautiful, Cecil. Thank you. Eric, some thoughts from you, and then we've got a few voices in our questions that I'll share out.
Oh, that's wonderful. Look, I think the important story here is the idea that individuals, when you come together, right, can make a difference. And I think that gets lost often in these stories. And I think it's important. So what I would tell folks is the first lesson is to be an organization, right? I don't mean just in community. You have to be in the mix. I don't mean official organization, but you have to be in company with other people in this period, just as we were in that period. And so that's what I would say to individuals. And then I would say to civil society, you have to leave open the space for people to enter in very, very different ways. I think it's important to say, right, I was probably the least experienced activist on this call, right, in the period of the resistance to ballot measure 9. I was not part of the LGBTQ community, right? I was firmly within student activism and within the racial justice movement in Eugene. It was a movement and a leadership that was able to figure out how to call people in, right? It became a number of firsts for me. It's my first public speaking, right? It was my first travel into rural Oregon, right? Staying in the homes of pastors and ministers and others. It was my first foray into research, and I'm not alone in that. One of the reasons the Pacific Northwest continues to have such a vibrant resistance to the authoritarianism that is rising is based off the experience that many people gained, right, in that period. The third I would say is don't be provincial. It's not just about your community. It's right, LGBTQ, Black, immigrant, right? The list goes on, right? This is also about the rules and laws, right, that we believe are important to the protection of rights. This is regional and it's national. And as we do our work locally, right, we have to understand that we are part of a national struggle. The last thing I would just say, Holly, is this. Look, there's going to be lots of, measure 9 or any other story, right? There are lots of space to deconstruct these stories, right? And to look at the tensions and the dissonance and the contradictions. Super important for learning lessons, right? But the idea that prevents us from celebrating what happened in our own movement histories is a real error on the part of both activists and leaders. We need to celebrate those victories that we have had. We need to let people know we've actually had victories, right? That there is victories in this space, that we can hold our ground. And No on 9 provides one of those lessons with the contradictions, with the nuances. It is a story of modern day resistance in the United States of America against the rise of fascism. And it is a story that should fall from the lips of everyone who is serious about standing up for democracy and against organized bigotry in this moment. It's chocked full of lessons.
Whew. Thank you, Eric. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I want to say an amen to every one of these. So one of the questions that came in, I think maybe the panelists were all peeking at it because I think you really all answered it. And so if you didn't catch it all, folks, go back and listen to the recording. I know it'll be sent out again. But the question was, given that this sort of targeting of the queer community, and not to mention others, is again so active, what kind of things should our organizations be addressing today? And what are the things that we should keep in mind as we work? So I really appreciate how each of you have spoken to that. Also, one questioner wrote in reminding us that that same year in 1992, Amendment 2 in Colorado did succeed at the ballot as we defeated Measure 9. And actually, as we faced the second version of Measure 9 in 1994, there was a similar measure in Idaho. And Idaho was able to defeat the measure too. And so in response to the questioner, we were in contact through those campaigns with the other states that were facing these measures. And some of the observations in No on 9 remembered, I think, even though all the efforts were hard fought, reflected on what was really unprecedented in Oregon that Colorado didn't see to the same degree, was all the different communities that mobilized in the way that we've just talked about, to have, the incredible breadth of engagement and mobilization. Anybody want to weigh in on that question of, what else was happening contextually in the other states at that time?
The Colorado campaign against Amendment 2 in that election cycle lost. And so Colorado ended up with an anti-gay and lesbian proposition that they had to deal with in the courts. That was unfortunately struck down. There's a question, what the differences were between those campaigns. I have to admit, it's just too long ago for me to remember. But I did do some work with the with Equality Colorado immediately after the campaign, and I really feel like they're just kind of different historical circumstances, different cultural circumstances. It's really an apples and oranges kind of situation. But what is really important to remember is that Colorado made tremendous advances in spite of losing. Equality Colorado continued working. They organized a Boycott Colorado campaign. That boycott campaign had real impacts, and they're in a much stronger and better position now than they were in then. And so, all was not lost in that situation. Lots of lessons were learned. One of the chief lessons that I think that the campaign leadership learned was when they discovered that the same people who sponsored Amendment 2 in Colorado had in a previous election cycle sponsored an English-only amendment. And so it really opened their eyes to the need to reach out broadly and try to figure out what is the broadest base coalition possible here, and how do we frame this threat in a way that takes it beyond the specific attacks on gay and lesbian people. So, all of those things were great lessons I learned from, sitting and talking to them. Within a year or so, we learned of perhaps as many as 11 different similar ballot measures being mounted across the country. Some of them did not happen at all, and in other cases, people were able to keep them off the ballot at the initiative level. And, Bob Rolfs in Oregon was one of the people who led the Bigot Busters who did that in Oregon. And I think a lot of the lessons that he learned in that work with his folks in that group ended up benefiting those people in other states. In fact, we published a story about it in something called the Fight the Right Action Kit that got distributed after No on 9. And people, when I traveled the country with the task force talking to folks, would ask me about Bob Rolfs and about that work, because it felt so, immediate, so entry level, something anyone could do, to just stand by the petitioning sites and talk to people on their way in and ask them, do you know what this measure is really about? So there were lots and lots of lessons like that.
Thanks, Scott. And that Fight the Right Action Kit in unformatted text archival version is linked to from noon9remembered.org in the resources section, along with an annotation of I think about 90% of the content came out of Oregon at that point. Thalia, you're unmuted. Anything to add?
Well, the other thought that came to me was, as we saw with Measure 9, and as we continue to see today all around the world, these right-wing nationalist groups use fear of the other, as an organizing concept. And fear is very effective as an organizing concept. And I think over time, we've learned, some of the lessons to sort of fight back, because it's not statistics or facts that can calm people down when they're kind of overtaken by this kind of primal fear of the other, whether it's gay people or transgender people or immigrants or any other group. It's immediate meeting people face to face, as Bob Rouse did with Bigot Busters, and saying, do you really want to sign that, anti-gay thing? Because can we just talk about it for a few minutes? And having a personal interaction, the kind of storytelling I think that we've learned to do over the years, and the calling to higher values and common values. It's like, wait a minute, what are we really about here? And in our case, weren't we all Oregonians? And don't Oregonians generally want to watch out for our neighbors? And trying to sort of calm people down by breaking through that othering, fear-based process that is a go-to strategy for the opposition that, works for them over and over and over again. And of course, builds on stereotypes and misinformation that we have to break down over time.
Yeah, thank you, Thalia. Some of the comments and stories happening in the chat, some of which are visible to all and some of which have ended up being private, really speak to that kind of how to organize in the face of fear, some of the creative actions such as ACT UP that were a big part of that era, and the small town kind of courage of people who, even a pastor on the coast who was fired for his opposition to Measure 9. Suzanne Farr commenting that the key lesson, as has been stated here, is call people into the work. Scott, as a born organizer, not only called Thalia in, but he also asked Suzanne to come from Arkansas to Oregon to work on the campaign. Ask people and they will come. Last question I think I'll pull from this to ask the panelists to respond to before we wrap up is that many of today's campaigns against LGBTQ rights and against critical race theory and on seem to be bankrolled by these dark money interests. Is that new? And what kind of challenges does that pose to today's resistance?
So I'll say as a philanthropist, and I think I'm not the only one here who works or volunteers in philanthropy, but there certainly is. Look, the truth is that there is a huge disparity in wealth that is growing, right, in globally, which means particularly here in the U.S. And when you have a situation where you have such disparity of wealth, right, you have unaccountable flows of revenue, meaning you have individuals with excess wealth who begin to dabble into politics as if it's a game, right? It becomes a thrill at the cost of real people's lives, right? And largely with dark money, we should understand. Dark money, large donors, that's what we have, right? And we have to contend with that. Yes, that will continue to be a problem until we bring, right, equity and economy globally into the United States. And there are many folks who are working on that. Despite that, though, right, I think it's important to also note and not let that obscure, right, that it is also a grassroots fundraising, meaning even if those big donors were absent, there would still be substantial resources in play, right, raised through small level individuals that would make this phenomena worthy of our attentions on that alone. So yes, there is dark money. We should understand dark money is being used to undercut, right, and redefine American democracy based off of exclusion. right? We should continue to move policies at the local and federal level, right, to take this on. But it means, right, if I could just be clear really, we are never going to match those dollars. So if the answer is, if the answer of resistance is based on the matching of revenue, we should pick another plan, right? It means we have to look for other forms of power, right? And what we learned from No on 9, because I'm going to turn it back to No on 9, what we learned in the campaign against ballot measure 9 are about other forms of power, the power that comes from being and building a large-based popular front, the power that comes from allowing people to tap into their cultural norms, right? There's different sets of power that come into play at large and small scale that end up defending rights. And I think that still holds today.
Thank you, Eric. I know we are needing to come to this time of wrapping up. There is so much more to say. I see that one questioner has asked about the security and the safety concerns that occurred in the face of the rising political violence at that time and lessons for today. I want to encourage, if you can, spend time on the stories at noon9remember.org, that we have an entire series on hate violence and deeper dives with analysis, including also further commentary from, at that time, Portland Police Chief Tom Potter and Officer Katie Potter on their efforts to challenge police culture around racism and homophobia. So dig in, and I think you'll see a lot more content on that. I also want to highlight convening that is coming up, the 22nd Century Conference, which is another fundamentally intersectional effort. And Eric, thank you for your work at Race Forward as well, that is continuing to highlight the leadership and the lessons out of so many movements and trying to create, again, the biggest possible tables for us to work on these issues. I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody's comments and questions, and I'm really sorry that we're not seeing the beautiful faces of everyone that I know is represented in our participant list. So many of you were absolutely fundamental to this struggle and are both continuing it today from 30 years ago. And then I'm also hoping of the many names that I don't recognize in the registration list that there are generations here who I appreciate so much your work coming to this from whatever your perspective, whatever your age, and hope that you appreciate being in the good company of all of the stories of noon9remember.org. We are so appreciative to Western State Center for having hosted this project. It was Eric's insight that the 30th anniversary was coming up and what were we going to do about it. Eric, it's really been an honor to partner with you, the vision that you brought to this. I really want to thank the American LGBTQ Plus Museum. I'm so excited to see what the museum does in coming years, and we're very honored to be one of your early digital programs. Thank you for all of your support. So thank you so much to the panel and to everybody here, and I want to wish you all the best as the struggle continues.